Okay, we continue to be interested in the behavior of our function at certain input values of x. In this video, we are going to be discussing the positive and negative properties of our functions. So let's start with some definitions. First, let's start with positive. A function is positive on an interval I if f of x is greater than 0 for all x in that interval. Okay? A function is positive on an interval I if f of x is greater than 0 for all x in I. So what that means is the y values are bigger than 0 for all x values in a particular interval. Okay, so what does that mean graphically? Well, let's draw a picture of a graph and see if we can talk about where f of x is positive on this particular graph. Okay, to start with, you should train your eye to find some very important points. The places where the graph crosses the x-axis. Okay, those are the zeros of our function, and we're going to, for this purpose, label them A, B, and C. Okay, those are my zeros. Those are the places where f of x equals 0. Okay, and now let me write that where that happens. At x equals A, x equals B, and x equals C. So there are three x values that send my y value to 0. All right, so looking at this graph, we want to talk about where this function is positive. So the function is positive when my y values are greater than 0. So this, remember, represents my y-axis, and my y-axis is positive above the x-axis and negative below. So I'm interested in where this function sits above the x-axis. So I see that it sits above the x-axis here and here. Between here and here it sits below the x-axis, and then from here on it sits above. Now the question is, how do you represent the answer for what it's asking? Well, the function is positive for which x values? So you're not going to give me the y values, you're going to give me the x values. So between a and b, so we can write if x is bigger than a and less than b, then f of x is positive. Between b and c it's not, and when x is bigger than c. So for these x values, f of x is greater than 0. Now notice I did not include the endpoints a, b, and c because at those points my function is equal to 0. So I'm looking for the x values such that f of x is greater than 0. That's where my function is positive. Okay? So now I think you probably could interpret what it means for a function to be negative. Well, a function is negative if, I should say, a function is negative on an interval I if f of x is less than 0 for all x in I. Okay? So a function is negative on an interval I if f of x is less than 0 for all x in I. So if I asked you where a function is negative, you would give me the x values that send your y values below the x-axis. So let's go back to that other graph that we had. Okay, we see that from all of these values, and forever on that to the left, my function is going below the x-axis. Between b and c, my function is also below the x-axis. So here, if I write x is less than a, or x is between b and c, and remember I'm not including those endpoints because at those endpoints the function is 0, my function is less than 0. Okay? So let's test our knowledge one more time. Let me give us another graph. And then we can see if we can answer it together. Straighten that up. Let's say I have, and those arrows tell me that I continue on in that behavior out towards infinity, left and right. Okay, so just like before, let's identify those special points that will be special to us for the rest of this course. And they're called the zeros of our function. They're the places where the function crosses the x-axis. Let's label them, in this case, as A, B, C, and D. Alright, so I want to know where my function is positive. So in this case, I'm looking for the x values that send my function above the x-axis. Okay? So I see that between A and B, let's write that down, so x is less than B, bigger than A, my function sits above. Between B and C it sits below, but between C and D it sits above again. So x less than D, bigger than C. For those x values, f of x is positive. Okay, let's see about my negative values. We see everything to the left of A, or x equals A, my function is going below the x-axis. So x less than A. Between B and C, my function sits below the x-axis. So x less than C, bigger than B. And from D on, my function sits below the x-axis. So for x greater than D. For those values, my function is negative.